Hi, everyone. It's Howard Gearhauser. On the line, you have my dad, Dr. Richard Gearhauser. And today, we're going to talk about a really important component of our program and our recommendations with our health coaching clients. And that is to eat a lot of seafood. And that's because of the omega-3 fatty acid DHA, which is really important for optimal health. So, we want to give you the background on DHA and why seafood's so important in terms of incorporating it into your diet. So let's jump right into it. So Dad, can you give us a little bit of background on DHA and why it's so critical for optimal health?
Okay, DHA is one of the omega-3 fatty acids. So this is always a big thing in my career. Doctors recommending fish oil to their patients for certain conditions, and that became very popular. And the studies on fish oil, there's been many, many studies, and there's even now fish oil drugs. So they take fish oil, they've made it into drugs because fish oil does lower triglycerides. So that's one of the uh, side effects, you might say, of fish oil is it lowers triglycerides. So it's actually an FDA approved drug to treat high triglycerides. And the studies in fish oil supplements have kind of gone back and forth. They seemed like, oh, certain fish oil supplements are good. And now, as we have more and more research where you can do what's called a meta-analysis and look at dozens of studies, it's not so clear cut anymore whether the fish oil supplements are the right way to go. So that's not something we tend to recommend. We don't recommend fish oil supplements except in certain specific cases where someone just absolutely will not eat fish. Trouble with supplements is they're processed. Processing changes things and mostly changes things for the worse, not the better. So if you process something, kind of detour it from nature's mechanisms, there's a good chance that it's not going to work or maybe even be harmful. So we're not big on fish oil because the omega-3 DHA is an extremely delicate molecule. So it doesn't stand up to a lot of processing. It also doesn't stand up to a lot of shelf life. And that's why we're a big fan of when the omega-3 is in the fish tissue, it's protected for things like oxidation that break it down and make it rancid. And when it's rancid, it can actually increase inflammation.
So we kind of touched on how the fish oil supplements isn't exactly the same thing as eating seafood. So keep that in mind. This is kind of a common theme with all of our videos. Getting back to nature is normally better than doing something that's more man-made, just as a rule of thumb. But again, there are extenuating circumstances where fish oil might make sense. Now let's talk about the molecule DHA. What specifically does DHA do that's so important in terms of our body?
Well, this is kind of on the cutting edge of science. As you know, what is so special about DHA? So DHA showed up on the planet about 600 million years ago, 5 to 600 million years ago, and it was formed by algae in the sea. So algae in the sea made DHA, and then that 500 million years ago, then that was incorporated into animal life. So the scientific name for animal life and plant life is eukaryotes. So eukaryotes became more complex with this DHA. And then DHA was found to be even more important and significant in vertebrates. So vertebrates, are mammals. And it was really important when animals began developing nervous systems. So DHA was incorporated into the neurons, into the synapses, that's the connections between neurons. It was incorporated into those structures at a very high level. And over evolution, over the last 500 million years, it's never been replaced. Even though in nature, there are two other molecules that are extremely similar. So DHA has 6 double bonds. So carbon can have a single bond or a double bond. So carbon in DHA has a double bond, and there's 6 of those, and they go a double bond of carbon to carbon, and then they have what's called a methylene group, which is not a double bond, and then it has another double bond. So there's 6 of these double bonds in DHA. Well, there's 2 other molecules in nature that have 5 double bonds, very almost identical molecule, and yet they aren't used by the nervous system. So it's interesting. There's something about DHA, and those other carbons, they have 5 double bonds instead of 6. They're much more stable. They're a lot less expensive as far as our machinery inside our body. The cost to our system to make it, they're a lot less expensive. They're more stable. They're more abundant, yet they're never used in the nervous system. So it looks like DHA has a special property, and there's theories out there that we'll talk about today of what is that special property of having the 6 double bonds. And then there's different structures of the molecule DHA. DHA, actually, and this is what happens in fish oil pills, DHA, if you just leave it sit, can shift. So these molecules can shift. So DHA, when it's protected in fish tissues, it's a planar molecule. And so we'll talk about why that might be an important issue. But it's never been replaced. So it seems like nature doesn't want to use anything else. And really, it seems like nature can't use anything else, or it would have used a less expensive, more stable molecule instead. But it never has. Now, there are groups out there that say DHA is bad. So I don't know how they can explain, well, why is it so concentrated in our nervous system if it's so bad? That absolutely doesn't make sense. Your photoreceptors, those are the molecules inside your nervous system that absorb light. They're over 50% DHA. How could you say DHA is bad? It's beyond me, but there is a big movement about, don't eat fish and, try to detox DHA out of your body. To me, that seems like insanity, especially when we talk about some of the magical things DHA seems to do.
So what are some of these seafood sources that have the highest concentration of DHA? That way, if we are bought into the perspective of DHA is good for us, what are some ways that we can start incorporating it into our seafood diet?
Okay, well, DHA is basically in most marine food, and that can be fresh or saltwater. So almost all fish or shellfish, so creatures that live in the ocean, seafood, contain DHA. Now, the most abundant source are the high-fat fish that are typically in cold water, and that's like the salmon, sardines. So they tend to have the highest amount. But other seafood like oysters, or say shrimp, or say crab, it also has a significant amount of DHA, not nearly as high as the fatty cold water fishes. And then the warm water fishes also have DHA. It's just not as much. And I'm not saying you need to have a ton of DHA. It's just that DHA is broken down. We do recycle it. It's so important that our body recycles it. So we don't necessarily need a ton of it. We don't need to eat a salmon every single day, but it is something that is broken down. It's broken down by light. Remember, I said that over 50% of the content of a photoreceptor is DHA, photoreceptor absorbing light. So there's an instance where we need a plentiful amount of DHA coming in. We can also synthesize DHA, but that process is extremely limited. And so if you go back into the geologic history of humans, it looks like humans stayed on the coast. And when they stayed on the coast, our brains expanded, our frontal lobes in our brain expanded. We became these smart, mystical creatures. And as we moved inland and as we turned to agriculture instead of foraging seafood, then our brains tend to have shrunk a bit since we've changed to an agricultural culture. So it looks like humans are kind of degrading now. And one of the theories of that is it's because we've gotten away from our roots of what allowed us to become this almost godlike creatures.
So a couple questions regarding the seafood. The first question is, do freshwater fish have DHA or is it just saltwater fish?
Yeah, I mentioned that before. That freshwater fish also have DHA, especially the cold water fish like trout have a pretty good amount of DHA.
And then the other question, I know this is a concern of a lot of people when it relates to seafood, is the toxicity, mercury, etc. What are your thoughts on that? Mercury poisoning, for example, coming from the fish versus the benefits of DHA.
Right. Well, yeah, there's a controversy. There's a lot of health gurus out there say, never eat fish. Even the government, tells women not to eat beyond a certain, like I think it's more than 3 times a week not to eat fish, even though the more fish you eat when you're pregnant, the better your pregnancy is going to do. Even though, yes, there's some mercury in fish, but one of the theories about the mercury in fish is because the fish is so nutrient dense. So besides DHA, it also is a great source of magnesium. It's a great source of selenium. Selenium and mercury are kind of competitive as far as absorption. So if you eat a high selenium source of food, then you don't absorb the mercury. So there's studies showing that, unless your detox pathways aren't working, you don't absorb much of that mercury. So that's something I don't think is a huge concern. It is, if you have mercury poisoning or if you're really, really ill, then it could be an issue. And so that's why in those people, I recommend going back to the lowest mercury source and kind of maybe sticking with that. And that'd be something like oysters, which has a good amount of DHA, but is low in mercury, or if you're going to eat fish, the sardines. So the further in the food chain, closer to algae you are, so the little sardines eat the phytoplankton, and the phytoplankton eat the algae. So you're very close. You're very close to step 1 on the food chain. That's going to be much lower in mercury than a swordfish, which I don't eat swordfish, even though it's very tasty because it's so high on the food chain. It's a giant fish that lives for years and years and years and eats hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of other fish. And so the mercury gets concentrated. So I always say eat the smaller size fish. Don't eat a big shark, a big sailfish, a big tuna. All these things are going to be much higher in mercury. I would say once in a while that's okay because, as I say, because of the nutrient density of seafood, I don't think it's a problem for a healthy person. So the sicker you are, the more you want to stick. Now, that brings up, should we go with algae DHA? And that is no, because that planar molecule is formed in the gut of the small fish. So that planar form is not flat. Planar, meaning flat. It's not flat in the algae. So if we eat the algae, it's not going to do us much. The algae DHA, it's not going to do us much good. Nature designed it that it travels up the food chain, and that modifies that molecule to make it the magical molecule that it is for super brain power.
So you mentioned before that we might have the ability, or there's proof that we have the ability that we can actually synthesize DHA within ourselves without consuming seafood. And this is probably not studied too deeply yet, but I know that a lot of our viewers and subscribers do follow the mentality that, hey, if it exists in nature, it is something that my body can create without adding something else. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we can create DHA. I think that's pretty well established in science. It's just that our ability to do it is very limited, and the need in our nervous system and really all of our cell membranes is so great because DHA is in all of our cell membranes, but it's highly concentrated in our nervous system.
Why do you think that ability is limited? Is this something that's always been limited, or is this something that you think is more due to our environmental factors now? How would you describe that?
Well, it was limited, and I think initially because humans, from the evidence, it appears humans uh, kind of appeared or developed, whatever you believe, how humans got here, evolved or were placed here or arose here. It was on coastlines. So I think the need wasn't there to make a lot because there was so much in the diet. So the ancient humans, they find piles and piles of shells next to their caves. Like, they're eating tons of shellfish. And then some more inland tribes would be on a river. And in Africa, where humans started, they found remains of tribes that had piles and piles and piles of catfish bones. So there's a species of catfish that would come from the ocean and swim up the rivers to spawn like salmon do. And so these catfish, you could just go and grab them. So here these humans had this almost like delivery service of fresh fish that nature just gave them. The same thing with shellfish. I mean, think every low tide, oh, wow, dinner time. I can walk out there. I don't have to chase anything. I just bend over and pick it up, crack it open, and here I've got brain food. So we had this abundant amount of DHA in our diet. We didn't need to make it ourselves. As I mentioned before, DHA is very expensive to make as far as the components it takes from within our body. It's expensive to make and it's delicate, but we got tons of it. And that's a theory. I can't go back and say, oh yeah, this is 100% sure. It's a theory, but it's a lot of facts, back up this theory that this is when our brains exploded, when we were on this coastline. And this is where we either branched off from the other apes or we appeared. This was kind of a main thing. And we had this huge frontal lobe. Remember, I told you that our photoreceptors, our synapses in our brain, our neurons in our brain, high percentage of that tissue is DHA.
And kind of like what you see in terms of for example, like ayahuasca or mushrooms, some of these things that were like put on earth that have this really high vibrational frequency, it would make sense that in order for the human consciousness to evolve, God or nature, the creator, whatever you want to call it, putting a bunch of seafood that's going to, make a human evolve that isn't quite there makes a lot of sense. So maybe the point then was like, we need the brain to grow. We need to supercharge the brain, get that developed to a point where maybe we can synthesize it more and more as we become more aware of it, and then don't have to rely so much on seafood, for example, to create it. So what do you think in terms of someone who's absolutely hell-bent against eating fish? What should they do?
Well, that's where I would get to fish oil supplements. If you get a company that has a process that doesn't use chemicals to extract the oils, and then they bottle it into dark bottles so the light damages it, as I already said, light damages, so it has to be in a dark bottle, and then heat damages it, so it should be refrigerated. So you get a dark bottle, someone you trust, recently manufactured, then that can work. And so that would be an option. Now, if you say, I got to go vegan, I'm not going to have anything animal based, then that's a tougher issue. You could buy the algae oil. I don't think that would be effective. I don't think it replaces DHA because we don't have the mechanism to twist that molecule back to being flat. Now, what that flatness does, it creates between those 6 double bonds, it creates a pi electron cloud. Now, you may notice the name of our program here, the name of our show is Quantum Possibility. Well, that part of that is because of the quantum electrodynamic theory. So the quantum electrodynamic theory is a theory that small things act differently than, say, Newtonian physics, where the apple drops from the tree because of gravity. Well, electrons and atoms, that doesn't happen. They work by a whole different mechanism. So quantum electrodynamic theory has proven that this is true. They do experiments where they manipulate electrons or protons. They find that electrons kind of have a bipolar personality. So electrons have properties of a particle. So a particle is kind of Newtonian physics, where there's something there that we can see, but it also has the properties of a wave. So light is a wave, but can also have properties of a particle. The same thing with electron. And electron can become and can give off or become a photon. So light and electrons are kind of interchangeable. So the issue here is that because of this wave phenomenon, so a particle is in one place, that's it. But a wave is spread out. So if you go down to a tiny, tiny level, what this means is that electron can be in lots of different places, okay? And life has used that to create the magic. If you think about how our brains work, I was reading where this guy who plays the piano was playing like Beethoven's piano concertos or something, and they're extremely complex and there's so many different things. And he did 4 or 5 of these long musical piano music, and he did them all by memory, which is almost unbelievable. It's almost like memorizing an entire encyclopedia. So here, our brain has the ability to do this, to remember all that stuff. Well, how does it do it? If you look at nerve transmissions where the sodium and potassium exchange places and the nerve impulse is propagated by that won't give you that kind of brain power. There must be another mechanism going on. So one of the ways to create energy and information is with this electron and its properties of being able to be in multiple places. So what can happen is an electron can be here, and then it can appear here without moving between the two, because it's just going along the wave. Now there's a distance to where that happens. And if you go down to tiny, tiny, tiny distances, which are called angstrom units. So if you're 8 angstroms or more distance between those stops where an electron can go, it won't work. It's too far. Well, DHA has 6 angstroms between it. DPA, that other omega-3 that I told you about that should have been used instead, doesn't have that property. So here, this mechanism, this particle and wave, how it can shift from one to the other, is part of how our brain does these amazing things, but it's not something science has figured out yet completely. There's theories about it. But I think the evidence is strong enough now that we could say, yeah, I better eat my fish 3 times a week, because I want to have that super brain power. Maybe I'm not going to be able to play 5 Beethoven concertos or whatever they're called. But, I want to be able to remember my phone number or whatever it is.
Well, maybe we could try a placebo type thing, give people fish that doesn't have DHA and see if their body can create it. So we'll have to keep investigating that. I mean, we are finding out that through the mind and the body and the connection to, this quantum field that connects everything, that our bodies are able to create a lot more than we've realized. But, we're not quite at that point to explain how to do that. So the easier way is just to eat fish. Again, if you're hell-bent against eating fish, maybe consider getting a supplement that's, not processed, the criteria that my dad mentioned. That could be another route, or the algae is another route too. Is there anything else you wanted to add in terms of DHA?
Well, DHA, when it uses this precise energy level, and when it uses it has a special waveform, and that waveform transfers information. So this system that is incorporated into DHA is kind of like a semiconductor. So in a way, this is something that humans have learned to tap into. And it's the reason we can talk now at a distance instantaneously because of this technology. So nature's been doing it for 500 million years. And we're just learning how to do it. But there's always that possibility that these artificial waveforms are going to interfere with these DHA waveforms. And so we have to be careful. We can't just blast into every kind of new wave that's out there and think that this is always going to be beneficial, because, nature doesn't rely on any other molecule. This is it. This is, there's no alternative to it. That's why I don't think it's a good idea to go with that bandwagon of the unsaturated fatty acids are bad. There's a big movement out there now that they're always bad. Well, they can't be. They're the meaning, or they're the instigator of our fantastic nervous system that has allowed us to create a computer so we can talk instantaneously around the whole world.
Yeah, so don't leave DHA out. If you're against eating fish, as we've mentioned before, there's other things you can try. You could even try meditating on it if you want to. But DHA is obviously in our body. It's very important for our nervous system and for our high-powered brains that are like supercomputers, and also important for the technology that we've created. Oftentimes, the technology that's manifested in our reality is a part of how nature works. That's how we're able to discover this technology in the first place. So keep all of that in mind. DHA is super important. You're going to need it if you want to function properly, especially with cognitive ability. Anything else you want to add?
No, there are theories that this is how we make memories. Science has had a hard time figuring out how memories are made and stored, and how do we remember things for so long. So there's a whole theory out there about this mechanism with electrons and the pi electron cloud of DHA being a big part of that.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to the Quantum Possibility channel if you're on YouTube, and that you've liked our fan page if you're on Facebook. And make sure to go check out our other videos too. We have a lot of free content, and we're here to serve you guys. So again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks, Dad.
Thanks.